The Tigrayan forces have begun handing over heavy weaponry to Ethiopian army as a part of an African Union-led ceasefire agreement. Surrendering of weapons is the central part of a peace deal which seeks to end a 2-year-long civil war that has killed thousands and displaced millions across northern Ethiopia.
Tigray forces began handing over heavy weaponry to Ethiopia's national army on Tuesday as part of an African Union-led peace process. The handover, around 20 miles northeast of the regional capital Mekelle, was overseen by a monitoring team made up of members of the two sides and a regional body, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Brigadier General Adwa Lebukan Peter is a representative of the monitoring team.
The effort that you are seeing today, or the ceremony you are seeing today, is a step in the right direction in achieving the African Union aim of silencing the guns by the year 2030, which translates to solving African problems by Africans.
The demobilization of Tigray forces who fought a 2-year war against Ethiopia's federal government is seen as central to the November 2nd ceasefire agreement, along with the restoration of services and resumption of humanitarian aid. Another part is the withdrawal of Eritrean troops who fought alongside Ethiopia's army but were not party to the truce. Eritrean soldiers pulled out of several major towns in Tigray late last month, but have not left Tigrayan territory, according to residents. Eritrea has declined to comment on whether troops will leave. The conflict created famine-like conditions for hundreds of thousands of Tigray's population, killed thousands, and displaced millions across northern Ethiopia.
Well, it looks like a story that perhaps is starting to look a bit more positive. For a bit more on that, we're now joined by Horn of Africa specialist Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who joins us from Washington in DC. Abdullahi, always good to talk to you. Happy New Year.
To you and yours, my brother Peter.
All right, so this ceasefire has been in place since November 2, so it's just over 2 months. Is it holding from what you're seeing?
It is holding. I think it's one of probably the most positive story. Again, it's early days, but it's one of the most positive stories from a region that is bedeviled with incessant conflict. And every time you talk about the Horn of Africa region, what comes to mind is if in places like Somalia, you have Al-Shabaab, now conflict in Ethiopia, a region that is beset with 2 years of not having adequate rain, something that has not been witnessed in 40 years. Stories like these that happened, a session of a hostilities agreement was signed in Pretoria, November 2nd, I think. After that, after 2 weeks, there were discussions in Nairobi on how to operationalize that process. We've seen now the monitoring team being in Mekelle, and now this, handing over of, major weapons. The only gap to one is we haven't had public comment, at least from the Ethiopian federal government, and the question of the Eritrean forces is still something that has not been resolved.
We'll talk about those two issues just now, but how significant is this handing over of weaponry? Because the Tigrayan forces are having to go in faith and in trust by handing over these forces to an enemy that they've been fighting for 2 years.
Well, that's the most important question, right? I think we had this conversation at the time when the agreement was signed. It felt like the federal government got a good deal, whereas the Tigrayan side felt like they got the short end of the stick. But the remarkable thing is, it is holding as of now. And then again, we don't have a great deal of time to go by because it's only been 2 months. But over the last 2 months, what we witnessed is humanitarian aid is getting into the region. Of course, the access doesn't meet doesn't match the need. That's a big problem, but it's something nonetheless, right? We have, banking and telecom services have resumed, not 100%, because you can only withdraw a certain amount of money. International transfers are still a problem. So I mean, there are things that weren't happening until this cessation of hostilities agreement was signed. For me, that is a positive development. That is not to suggest that things might not change. This is not to suggest that any of the parties right now can say, you know what, oops, we're sorry, we're going back to doing what we've done. But the damage that will cause will be irreparable. So I think, again, you mentioned they're doing this in hope. I think it is a hope that for the next few months and weeks and months, this will hold, and for people's lives to resume normalcy. I mean, millions of people, not just in Tigray region, but also elsewhere, are facing significant humanitarian crises, multiple crises, to be honest with you, in Afar, in Amara region, and now increasingly in the Oromia region, which is becoming the next frontier, which is turning into a powder keg. But I think having some of these things is very important. People need to go back to farming, looking after their livestock, not people being kidnapped, raped, and jailed, and people being killed. It's a positive development, but it's the one that we take with a fair degree of caution.
One variable that you mentioned are the Eritrean troops. They were not part of the peace deal, so they're not bound by any agreement. How dangerous could that be, that we have an active player not bound by any kind of agreement, and we just have to trust that they'll do the right thing?
You're right. I mean, that was one of the biggest gap within that agreement, right? Because in that agreement, Eritrea wasn't mentioned once. They just said actors. They just said, external actors. But I think what we have to bear in mind is that there are very few leverages over the current Eritrean government that is available. This is a country that has been sanctioned to death. That hasn't changed the opinions or the behavior of the authorities in Asmara. But the most important thing that we have to bear in mind is that if, and this is a massive if, the internal dynamics of Ethiopia holds, that is the federal government as well as the other actors, including Oromo, Tigray, and the rest, if they sort out their problems, not necessarily become brothers in blood, but not fighting, Eritrea's premium will go down. If Abiy for a second feels that TPLF or TDF will not be a problem to his leadership, he will not have a need for them. The only reason why he needs them right now is he's afraid potentially that TPLF might go back to the bush. So I think, again, it is a question of going on hope than anything else, because Eritrea has demonstrated over the last few decades now it can destabilize the region. But if Ethiopia internally is stable, it is not very difficult to isolate Eritrea because it's already on a self-imposed isolation. So you're right. I think it's one of the major gaps within the agreement, but I think my sense at that time was what they wanted to do, the big players behind the scene, was to ensure that Abiy is pulled away from Isaias Afewerki's orbit so that, he feels far more secure. Early days again, it's only been 2 months now, but things are holding so far. In November, we never thought we'll even have a week, let alone 2 months now. Let's hope it stays like this, because I want to stay on the optimistic side this year. Because if Ethiopia, with over 100 million people, is stable, grows at the rate that it was growing before the conflict, it will not only be good for Ethiopia, but also for the region and potentially for the continent.
Putting the guns down is, yes, peace achieved perhaps, but that might be just dealing with the symptoms. The underlying issues that cause the conflict don't miraculously disappear just because we've signed an agreement. What's going to be done to deal with that for the long term?
You're right, Peter. I mean, let's not delude ourselves. A lot of the time, peace processes that have worked on this continent have been short-term. Look at the example of South Sudan. This country now over the last decade since its independence has just been mired in conflict. I think one of the issues that really ought to be at the forefront is the question of the governance gap. As long as leaders think that the only way they can resolve problems is the use of force, as long as leaders, particularly African leaders, think that they can willy-nilly extend their terms, remove term limits, we will have problems. You've seen a series of coups on the continent, right, over the last few years now. But one of the things that really gives me comfort is the fact that an Afrobarometer carried out a study that demonstrated 75% of Africans prefer democracy to any other form of government. That is massive. But I think we need to begin addressing some of these underlying issues, including the governance gap, including the question of economic growth and development and inclusion. If you look at some of the countries on the continent, Ethiopia included, unemployment rate have gone out of proportion. So what, particularly in the current climate, where economic growth, not just on the continent, but across the world, is going to face serious problems for various reasons. We'll not be only facing crisis, but we'll be facing polycrisis, multiple crises at the same time. If you look at most of the African countries, the GDP to debt ratio is out of whack. If we don't address that, we're not only going to get stuck for now, but even the next few years. The reason why on the continent, the reason why we had a bit of growth and development over the last decade that is now slowing down was some of the debt forgiveness that were incurred, and the country started, feeling like they can spend on public goods. And then for a while, Africa, some of the African countries were the fastest growing economies. And I think the party has ended, the era of cheap money has ended. So the point is, we need to address the governance gap, and we really need to enhance and grow the economy that is really struggling in most of these countries. Otherwise, we'll not have problem for now in terms of employment, but also in the future. Some of these young men and women who are coming out of school and coming of age, they could be used as foders by bad faith actors, be it transnational jihadi movement or some bad faith actors that could use them to start civil war. And the problem in civil war is a vicious cycle. If you've not been growing already, you have civil war, you'll go back 2 or 3 steps, and that will take a very long time to address. So for me, the principal issues that need to be addressed is the governance gap. We need to not have just elections, we need to have elections that matter. It's not just an election that we count the ballot, elections that people's values and hopes and aspirations and dreams count. We just don't need to have an economy that grows for a few in urban areas, but also for the entire country, not just for people of money, but also for the young men and women who are coming out of school and they want to contribute to the development of this continent.
All right, we've run out of time, but perhaps one last question you might be able to address quickly. Conflict often gives us an opportunity to rethink and reset. Do you think that Addis Ababa, Abiy Ahmed might be re-looking the whole federal project after the Tigray experience?
It should. It is a massive opportunity for Ethiopia that had this constitution since 2005, a constitution that, with all its problems, has been able to provide at least a valve, safety valve. You've got over 100 ethnic groups, but, it's because of decentralization of power and authorities and resources, that has acted as a valve. But many have seen, particularly those who support centralization of authorities, they've seen this constitution as a problem. But this is an opportunity for people to go around the country and ask, what future does Ethiopia and Ethiopians want? If they prefer centralized authority, That is for Ethiopians. If they prefer the current constitution with multi-ethnic federalism, that is their decision. If they prefer none of this and they want to start afresh, that again is their prerogative. But they need to be involved, not just as a box-ticking exercise, but as a substantive process that will give people their say. Otherwise, 10 years from now, when we'll have our own children and grandchildren, me and you will be sitting here. I don't want us to have a conversation about should Ethiopia have a federal or centralized kind of constitution and governance mechanism.
Abdullahi, we'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks so much indeed. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you.
My pleasure, my brother.
Thank you. All right, that's Horn of Africa specialist Abdullahi Boru Halakhe speaking to us about developments taking place in Tigray, north of Ethiopia.